All right, so I'm going to start with the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, which was done by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente in 1995 to 1997 by Dr. Vince Folletti from Kaiser and from Dr. Bob Onda from the CDC. The study included 17,500 adults, 70% of which were Caucasian and 70% of which were college-educated adults as well. The whole purpose of the study was to figure out events such as experiencing violent abuse or neglect between the ages of 0 and 17. And then those events can cause the childhood experiences to be linked to risky behavior, or chronic health conditions, low life potential, and as bad as early death. Within the ACE study, 67% of the 17,500 adults recorded that they encountered at least one ACE or adverse childhood experience. And then 12.6% of those members in that study recorded that they had experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. The most recent study that I found in the state of Kansas was done by the CDC with the use of the Behavioral Risk Factors Surveillance System, which is a telephone survey system that they use to collect data in the eastern part of Kansas in 2014. So that original study started in 1995 through 1997 through the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, but they're continuing to collect data. And the most recent one that I was able to find was the survey in our state in 2014. And then one of the quotes from the video, Dr. Robert Block, which is the former president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, says that adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. So just some background information there on the study and what it is and all of that kind of stuff. And I think we're going to move to, who's up?
Stress and physiology.
Yeah.
Oh, is that me? Okay. Sorry about that. So yeah, just to kind of go off of what Dylan was talking about, the ACEs study. In the beginning of the video, Dr. Nadine Burke Harris, she discussed how we need to look at these. We need to look at the ACEs. We need to look at abuse and neglect in children a little bit differently than it's currently being looked at. And she cited some information about how these stressors, not just regular stressors, but like abusive and neglectful at home, serious stressors, have a severe effect, not emotionally, well, emotionally, but not only emotionally, also physiologically, and on the body itself, physically. She cited that some of the effects are brain development, the immune system, it affects the hormones, the hormonal systems. How DNA is actually read and transcribed. Long-lasting effects include lung cancer and heart disease. So people with prolonged stress that come from the childhood abuse and neglect actually have an increased risk of lung cancer and heart disease in the future. And also she said that there's a 20-year difference in life expectancy. So I did a little bit of kind of research into this because a lot of these claims are, I mean, you think of stress and how it affects you, we all know that it's bad. And you can just say, yeah, it's probably because, you know, it increases your heart rate, which it does. But I thought that this is all interesting and how it affects all these different aspects of our health. So I did a little bit of research into that. And it turns out that cortisol, most of us have heard of cortisol, but it's known as the primary stress hormone. What that's going to do is increase glucose in our blood, so free glucose, which is, associated, if you know about, diabetes and how that affects you. And as we know, it's a systemic disease. So what that does is it's going to not only just increase our heart rate, it's also going to decrease our abilities to regulate our hormones, because of that increased, blood sugar. We're going to our pancreas is going to need to release more insulin, and then that chronic stress put on our body is going to deteriorate us until we're not sensitive to these kind of hormones in the future. So that's just a little bit of insight into it. I just kind of thought I'd throw that out there. And another one that I thought was pretty interesting when we're talking about how the psychological stressors affect us physiologically and physically is I found a study where it says researchers have discovered that the genes of mice exposed to chronic stress over time, modifications were most associated with genes related to a variety of mental illnesses such as depression, autism, spectrum disorder, and schizophrenia. So what that tells us is that, so we have the physiological changes, the physical changes, and how it's associated with lung cancer and heart disease. Not only that, but also these mental illnesses. So I thought that was really interesting in that. Also that COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, is 2.5 times higher with people who have positive ACE scores, as well as depression.
The example she gave in the video about the bear and being in the woods, I thought that was an easy way to understand like what exactly is taking place inside the body, and during that one incident, where if this is a chronic incident that's happening at home, that's the way your body's continuing to react, and then eventually that's the way it reacts all the time, rather than
exactly
as an impulse.
Yeah, the nervous system as well. When you go through the list of how it affects you, it's like every body system, and the nervous system is going to learn how to release these hormones.
Right.
Yeah, and there's positive feedback loops in our body. So absolutely.
I just think from experience, you can see the kids that have gone through stress a lot, how they react physically to stress. Being nervous, kids just react completely differently, and you can kind of pick out the kids that probably are going through stress a lot on a daily basis. They just react differently, and you can see it physically. So I think everything you were saying is really relevant, to what we deal with in the classroom.
And at that time in their life, they're still relatively young, and those physical changes are already kind of starting. So just, if you go by what you said, 20-year life expectancy difference, that makes a huge change if that stress continues to, carry on throughout their life, because that's what they've learned,
How they deal with things that they're learning.
So I guess we need to move on to the social barriers,
Yes.
accepting the ACE scores from a medical standpoint.
As a health issue. Yeah. So one of the things that one of the things that I was finding as going through the information about ACE teachers, typically so many of our teachers, people going into the teaching profession, will have a much lower ACE score than the students that they are teaching with. And therefore, as a teacher, it's very hard for many to understand exactly what some of our students, a lot of these previous, stressor and trauma-informed experiences, and because as many teachers cannot specifically relate to what their students through or are experiencing at the present. So that's one of the social barriers that we run into, as well as understanding disability in society, whether it's a teacher or some store, for instance. it's easy to understand somebody can't do, can't run as fast because they have one leg versus two legs, or they're in a wheelchair, or they're unable to do something physically. You can see it. When it is an ACE or a serious trauma in a student's life, it's not something that you can outwardly see. Therefore, understanding it and how it affects that student, you don't easily see it. It's not an easily disclosed information. Our students don't show up on the first day of school with a shirt telling, what is the trauma in their lives, what are the stressors that they've experienced, and there's not a guidebook for each of however many students you have in that year, whether it's 20 in an elementary class or 100 plus in middle and high school. And then trying to understand, eventually slowly building a relationship, and you may find more information of a student who slowly discloses information, or somebody already had to deal with a larger in their life, and therefore is already on the radar of our student services, guidance counselors, workers that the student has already worked with. But many of our students coming in, you have a handbook that let them know that they've been abused. They've school hungry, but they school not hungry just today. They've come to school hungry every single day, and they know that the only time they get a chance to eat is at school, or they don't know who's going to be at home when they get home. And for many of our teachers, even to that, so many of our counselors don't have specific experience with a lot of this trauma. They may have studying it, but again, they haven't experienced themselves, so it's a little bit different. As well, going into that, you have issues with there's so much stigma behind mental abuse, or neglect, or social neglect, or psychological disorder with it. Both parents as well as aren't necessarily interested or able to disclose that information for one reason or another, or because of the abuse that's happening at home, the child is afraid to disclose the trauma going through, and therefore trying to disclose that information is it's not safe for them, which is an additional safety factor, and makes it a lot more difficult to serve those.
So those are some great points, and those social barriers, I think, is why it's so important for teachers and people going into the education field to understand the signs of trauma in kids, because like you said, Monica, we might have a much lower ACE score than the students, and also a lot of times there are silent you could say disabilities, or silent signs of trauma. So what I did was I looked at a case study of students that had been through trauma, and they reflected in this study, they reflected back on their time in school and what their teachers could have done differently to help them. And in the study, it says that traumatic stress manifests itself in internalizing and externalizing behaviors that can significantly impact academic and social functioning and the psychological well-being of youth. So it's important to know what to look for. In one student's study, it said that they had their advice for educators on how they could have handled their situation better. One girl said that they could have been more flexible in understanding of her lessened ability to meet expectations or learn in the same way that she had before. So like she had had a certain level of success, and after her traumatic event, her abilities actually decreased. She reflected on how much longer her work took for her to do due to difficulties focusing and concentrating, and how she could have benefited from extra time to complete projects. She recalled struggling to understand abstract ideas and questions due to her anxiety and confusion. She didn't ask for extra time, so this kind of goes back into what Monica was saying about even knowing, and because they're so silent sometimes, she didn't even ask her teacher for extra time because of her fear of her teacher's response. She didn't want to be singled out in class, be humiliated. Her anticipated response stemmed from her belief that trauma issues are unique and that you can't understand it if you haven't gone through it. So that could be something that our students might be thinking if they can kind of sense that we haven't gone through what they've gone through. But it's important to know that they're not alone. And another student emphasized the importance of for schools to get the message out there to students who are quietly dealing with trauma that they are not alone, acknowledging that many students will not approach their teachers. She suggested that a variety of written materials, handouts, business cards, brochures, books should be made available to students. And of course, a lot of times it is, but just acknowledging that in class. The ability to pick up on signs is really important. Another student spoke of obvious signs such as struggling socially to find herself, the way she dressed and stuff like that, and also the more subtle signs like that she exhibited through body language. And she described herself as completely shut off. Her emphasis on teacher attunement was related to her belief that teachers noticed, if teachers noticed, then they might initiate and support the student once that relationship has been formed. So just the importance of noticing those small adjustments in behavior. Some more obvious signs that we can look for, especially in young children, and I work with K through 5, so this is specific to, I guess, my clientele, but students that they will be avoidant, anxious, clingy, general fearfulness, helplessness, restlessness, impulsive, hyperactive, physical symptoms like that Kyle talked about as well in the physiology. Difficulty identifying what's bothering them, inattention, daydreaming or disassociation, irritability, aggressive behavior, sexualized behavior, loss of recent developmental achievements, like that first student I talked about. If you see that they are, you're assessing students and they're at a level, like a high level, and then something happens and they're losing their developmental achievements, that's something to be concerned about. Repetitive post-traumatic play, talking about traumatic event and reacting, that's easier to identify when the student's actually talking to you about it, and then we can get them help. Sadness, depression, anxiety, poor peer relationships and social issues. It says that there are the complex trauma affects all domains of a child's development and functioning, but there are two domains I wanted to specifically point out: cognition and the physical domain. In cognition, they can have difficulty paying attention, lack of sustained curiosity, problems processing information, problems focusing on completing tasks, difficulty planning and anticipating consequences, learning difficulties, developmental delays, problems with language development. And in the physical domain, having sensory issues, being hypersensitive to physical contact, and increased medical problems, like we mentioned, and then problems with coordination and balance, which I thought was also really interesting. So those are some just statistics I pulled to talk about how we can better recognize the signs of trauma in our students.
Caitlin, would you say that a lot of those things might describe a healthy, well-adjusted kid as well? Would you say that the change from one to another might be an indicator?
Yeah, I think that is something that I noticed also, because there's a lot of students that are, you know, hyperactive or that get sad from time to time, and some children just have problems making friends, and doesn't necessarily mean anything's wrong. But I think one aspect that I thought was important was on that second study. The student said that she hoped that teachers could be more in tune with their students and the changes that happen with them, just subtle changes. So, and that's like particularly hard for me, for example, because I'm an art teacher. So I only see my students once a week, and I have, you know, upwards of 300 at one school and 400 at another. So it can be really hard to notice subtle changes, but especially for classroom teachers, and just trying to get to know students and knowing what is their kind of their normal, and then knowing, you know, looking for changes. I agree. I think that is important.
Yeah, like I think most of the time, whenever a sign that we're going to recognize potential trauma, is not going to be one specific big outburst. It's going to be subtle things that are continuous, that are more alarming than the one outburst that may happen as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that's what brings back to the kind of the controversy with diagnosing it, because, you know, like you said, dissociation, like school psychologists might want to just diagnose them with like a PD or psychological disorder instead of finding the root cause, because most of the time those professionals don't see the change. They just hear about the symptoms, and they're brought in to diagnose rather than to observe changes. So it's hard to accept trauma as a, I guess, diagnosis when it's so related to so many other things. It's hard to pinpoint what the actual cause is, and you're probably not going to get help from parents on diagnosing trauma. So probably happening in the home.
Yeah.
Right. We kind of I feel like we have to kind of be the student's advocate for it. Like you said, if you can't, you know, necessarily trust parents or guardians to be the advocates, and also the child study team might not, I mean, they don't get to see the children on a regular basis. So I think it's important to have a solid group of advocates for every student. Whenever they are doing IEPs or any sort of situation at my school, they include us specials teachers as well, and ask for input in situations for children, because they want to really get a well-rounded view of the whole situation, which I think is really important.
And I imagine one of the additional barriers that sometimes pops up is that so many of these children with a high score or the additional trauma in their lives, the parents have also undergone or are undergoing much of the same type of trauma, and therefore are limited in their ability to relate to it, as well as some of these children, their families are very transient, or they move from one school to one district to another. So having that prolonged information about a student and being able to see the differences of how were they in first grade, now how are they in second grade, third grade on up. If you are moving a couple times a year or every school year, your teachers that you're working in the school haven't seen how you used to be.
Right. That's a really good point. And I actually just had something happen this week where I wish I would have known information about a child to better help them, because they just moved from another school to our school this year at the beginning of the year. So I've had them for 10 weeks, and I didn't know this important information about a child from last year. And the only reason I found out is because I asked the art teacher at the other school about the child. I just said, oh, hey, they had you last year, you know, just wanted to say hi. And they told me some really important traumatic information about that child. And I'm like, I wish there were more. I think there should be procedures in place that teachers know that important information, because I don't know to ask about every child. I can't go to every classroom teacher and say, oh, we have a new student. Is there anything I should know about them? Like that information should be, I feel like more readily available to everyone that works with that child.
Yes. I had a student last year that we thankfully found out almost through the grapevine of our student service counselors contacting the school where the child had come from, that the other entire district, it wasn't even within our district, that they had tried to do an EBD behavior recommendation, and the parents had declined. And so now we have a child who doesn't receive any services, but has clearly undergone some trauma, and the parent has undergone trauma. And so trying to serve the student and family becomes very difficult, especially, and again, this was a child that you could outwardly see the issues in the behavior, but it was a while that we had the student before any information was found out.
Yeah. So, so some strategies for creating a trauma-sensitive classroom can kind of bring out some of these conversations from the students, can talk to the teacher. I looked at a couple sources, and one good source was a book called Fostering Resilient Learners, and just bullet point strategies. Well, actually, the first thing I looked up was from NEA, and their biggest recommendation was teaching styles. So just like oftentimes you don't know if there's students that are experiencing trauma, so you kind of have to get your teaching style in order just to kind of get the whole realm figured out. So what they said is just predictable routines. So if they have the same routines as they come in the classroom every day, especially with younger students, elementary students. And if there's going to be a change to routines, you give them an advance warning of any changes. Have students repeat verbal instructions. So any instructions that you give, have them repeat it verbally. So you know they're all focused at the same time. Having written instructions along with verbal instructions, and using visual prompts with your written and verbal instructions. So basically just hitting on every teaching style that you can will help create a safer environment for those going through trauma, because they all learn and process in different ways. And then this can just make them more comfortable in the classroom. Another big key bullet point was building relationships. So, and I know like a lot of us specials teachers, where we teach more than, we don't just have one classroom. I know I see, about 500 kids a day. I'm sure you're all in about the same situation. Just asking questions that set up simple answers. So, a lot of times we can't get in there and just have full-on conversations. So just really building that relationship by asking simple questions, like instead of, what's it like at home? What do you do at home? Just asking questions like, what do you do for fun outside of school? And, they can give a simple question. They really feel comfortable telling you those things, but they feel like you care at the same time. And that's easier for us as special teachers than the classroom having, full-on conversations. Stuff like, how do you get along with your siblings? You can just, we as specialists can just say, hey, how many brothers and sisters? And usually that leads into a conversation, and they feel like you care about them. And then creating a safe environment in the classroom. I'm a PE teacher, so a lot of these things are really hard to do. I don't know if anybody else is a PE teacher. I know we're all specialist teachers, but.
I actually am a core teacher. Sorry.
Oh, you're a core teacher. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, when she sent the email, I thought she said we were all specialist teachers. So just like ending negative conversations immediately. So when the students have their free time, we just have to end those conversations immediately. Create a safe space. I know this is kind of a trending thing in classrooms, is creating peace corners or timeout. I don't know, whatever you call them. I don't know if your schools are doing those, but just creating a safe space they can go to if they need to escape the environment. And it can just be just like at any time they can use it. Do any of you use peace corners or safe spaces or anything like that?
Yeah, I did. I started it last year because I had students. I decided I wanted to do it because I have a lot of students with like autism, and so I created a sensory station. But I have actually found a lot of other students, because I introduced it like anyone can use it if they need it. And I've actually found out a lot of students end up wanting to use it to just work alone, or to have a safe place where they can go and talk to my little teddy bear and stuff like that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the Peace Corner, I think you see a lot of negative and positive views by the public. But from my experience, I think the Peace Corner type thing in your classroom works really well. That way they don't have to come talk to the teacher. They can just go and not be noticed. And just self-regulate yourself. Yeah, self-regulation, and that's another huge thing, is teaching them to be able to pinpoint what emotion that they're feeling. I know our school district uses the zones of regulation. I'm sure a lot of school districts use that, but finding their zone and figuring out how to self-regulate themselves into a green zone is what we call it. But teaching them about emotions. They have a tool called the feelings wheel, where it breaks down like 4 major feelings, and then the feeling wheel, like, it goes bigger and bigger and bigger, and then that is broke down into like 10 different feelings. Anger isn't just simply anger for a lot of students. It's broke down into like frustration and different things like that. So that's a good technique you can use in the classroom. And I know, like, in our school district, a lot of us use the feelings wheel within our Peace Corner, because a lot of times they just want to get away and they don't know why. But they maybe go to the Peace Corner and they feel stress, and they don't really know what stress is at the elementary. Well, they know what stress is because they felt it, but they don't know how to verbally express what stress is. So just kind of teaching them that at a young age. And then, there's so many strategies to create a trauma-sensitive classroom. So I could talk for several minutes, but one thing is just meeting students where they are. So, giving them some space. A lot of times when kids go through trauma, they don't want to talk about the trauma. So don't be like a prying, just give them time. If they want to come talk to you about it. And like you said, Caitlin, a lot of times they don't feel comfortable saying, hey, I need more time with this assignment. But if you see them struggling, maybe you, as a teacher, just take that opportunity to give them more time. Meet them where they are. I think a lot of students struggle with nervousness talking to peers or to adults when they need help. So, it's just one of those things that we just have to give them opportunities, give them as many opportunities as we can. I know another strategy that our school district uses is they do the zones of regulation at the beginning of the day, and they just use a QR code. We're a 1-to-1 iPad school, so they can scan that QR code and they can kind of journal about their feelings, choose pick where they are in the zones, and it's completely private. The teacher will see it, and then it'll give the teacher kind of an idea of where they're at the beginning of the day. It works out really well because you just have a little bit of insight to what the kids are feeling. And then another strategy is just use mindfulness in the classroom. It's another one of those controversial things because I know when you call it meditating, that makes it related to religion, but I know the mindfulness breathing exercises have been super successful in my classroom. Quiet reflection time, guided imagery and movement, just going through steps in their mind. We use it in PE just as a simple going through the movement in their mind, eyes closed before they do it physically. And I know it helps them calm down, takes away the nerves of failing at something. So I could imagine, going through trauma, just going through that, guided by imagery. And I know there's a lot of apps out there for mindfulness. And then again, just like helping them learn to self-regulate through mindfulness training, I think is something that was came up a lot on my searches on the topic. But I'd like to hear about all the strategies you all use in your classroom. Any?
Does anyone use any?
I don't know about strategies, but two things. One thing that Brian said, one thing that Monica said earlier, the mindfulness, absolutely. And I don't know if that's a strategy, but it's, recognizing. And what Monica said earlier about the social demographic differences between the teachers and the students, I think that's a really important thing to kind of keep in the front of our brain there, just to remind ourselves that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Brian, one of the first things you talked about was learning strategies and how kids like to learn. One of the cool things, I'm a middle school teacher, and one of the cool things we do is we have kids, when they come into the 6th grade, they take a survey that lets them know, according to how they answered certain questions, how they responded to certain scenarios, what kind of learner they are. And then once it told them, this website that we use, once it tells them what kind of learner they are, it tells them what kind of things they can do to help better their experience and digest information, all of that stuff. So I think if a student is experiencing trauma, then that is their go-to way of digesting information. So if a teacher decides that they're going to stand up in front of the class and give a lecture today, if they're not an auditory learner, obviously that's not going to be beneficial to them. But if they have the information to know, okay, this is how the teacher's going to lecture, but I'm going to make myself, a study guide so I can see all of this kind of stuff that the teacher is saying. I can see it on paper, and that if I'm a visual learner, that's a way for me to digest. So it's just something that they're comfortable with, I think, is important to do for a trauma-informed student.
I agree. I think, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
That's okay. I teach 7th grade social studies, and so I have just over 100 students a school year. And one of the things I do at the beginning of the school year is I have both a paper copy that I have the students write their information about them, of their name and kind of a goal for the year, and any information I let them know they can put a concern on there, or something that is a stressor for them that I let them know I'm not going to share with anybody else unless it's a safety concern. And I've had students disclose all sorts of things on there sometimes, but also I have them on the sheet write in their siblings, of how many siblings, the names of their, if they, where, or if they go to school, how old they are. And I've been able to find out just a lot of information, both I've learned over the years as a parent and a teacher, that there's a lot birth order, but also when you start looking into, okay, the student has a lot of either older siblings, younger siblings, step siblings, half siblings, it kind of gives you a little bit more insight into the student and, their home and where they're coming from, as well as updating other information whenever, another couple weeks into the school year, I do another version, the same type of form, but in Google, kids can go into, because we're on a school, and so the kids can go in their iPad and fill out a Google form for me, and I get information of how do you get to school, do you like our tall tables or short tables, and other relevant information, as well as asking more of those questions. Who do you stay with during the week? Are you always with the same parent? Do you have go back and forth? And I've had kids, by putting that information there, again, it gives you a little bit more insight into that student and where they're coming from without them having to verbally talk about it.
Speaking of nonverbal signs or things to look for too, or ways that we can help, like I guess since I'm the art teacher here, things I just have to be really careful and being aware of what kids are drawing, because a lot of times you'll give them that opportunity for just like a free time, and their imagination or things that they've experienced comes out. And I've had to give artwork to the counselors and social workers with concerns about a child because of what they're putting down on paper, and things that I would not get otherwise, from them verbally, or not even suspect. So I think, just being really aware and giving them, like Brian said, giving them opportunities to talk, or like Monica said, non-verbally to write it down, or like I say, draw, just giving them opportunities to share that information with you. It's surprising how much they'll share if just given the opportunity.
Yeah, I'd say one thing that I do that helps engage students is, before school, I'm hanging out with the students that whole 45-minute time. I'm always talking to different students. I'm not one that's holed up in my classroom. During lunch, I eat lunch with the students, 3 or 4 times a week. And you'll be surprised what you learn. They're really comfortable talking to you when you're not in the classroom. And it's probably the number one thing that I've done to help engage with the students. And it's sitting down by them on the lunch table. You'll learn stuff you don't want to know, but
relationships are huge.
It's it's huge, because then they trust you in the classroom. It's like a flip switch. Yeah, the switch flips, and then the classroom, all of a sudden they want to tell you everything. But
I feel like we've covered a lot of the bases.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think we're good. I think that was a good conversation. So
Yep.
I learned a lot.
yeah. All right.